Hi everyone, Sam here. Welcome to another episode of Azure Snippets. Today we're going to talk about a service called Azure Private Link. Private Link's been around for a little while now in preview, and it's a service which is designed to allow you to inject resources into your virtual network. In particular, either Azure PaaS resources or resources that come from a service provider who's also hosting in Azure. We're going to focus today on the PaaS resource side of things. If you're interested in the service provider options, I suggest looking at the documentation around that. So, as far as PaaS resources go, Private Link is a service which basically allows you to take those PaaS resources and inject them into your virtual network. What this means is your PaaS resource now becomes a member of your network. It gets a private IP address and any access to it goes over your virtual network. This has some significant benefits in terms of security, egress restrictions that you can apply, but also accessing those sort of resources from your on-premise over ExpressRoute or VPN, and from peer networks that are attached to your virtual network. On the face of it, Private Link and service endpoints seem quite similar, but there is a fairly significant difference, and that's the fact that resources are actually being attached to your virtual network. With service endpoints, if you take something like SQL or storage, when you set up a service endpoint, you're restricting access to that resource from your virtual network. But you're still leaving the virtual network to go to it. It still has a public IP address. You're just restricting the access using the firewall to make sure that only the resources you want can access it. It also means that when you come to lock down access out of your virtual network using NSGs, you still have to grant access to the SQL server or storage tags to access their resources. So that means someone on your virtual network can actually get to any storage or SQL resource within that region, denoted by the tag, rather than just the specific resource that you want to give access to. With Private Link, things are changing. So first, as I mentioned, the resource is actually attached to your VNet and it has a private IP address. So when you access it from your virtual network, traffic is only going over the virtual network to that private IP. It's not going out to a public IP address. Secondly, because the Private Link is attached to a specific resource, you're only granting access into that resource. You're not having to open up the NSG to grant access to all of the resources in, say, the SQL or the storage tag. Because your traffic is only traversing the network, it's not actually going by the NSGs at all. It's just going via the Private Link, which is scoped to that specific SQL server or storage account or whatever other service you're using in this. So you can see on the diagram in the screen at the moment, you've got this virtual network which is able to access these Azure services directly from the virtual network without requiring NSG rules to be opened, and it means we don't have to open up the PaaS service to be accessible from the internet at all. So things like storage accounts and SQL Server, you can now lock them down so they're only accessible via the Private Link, making them much more secure. Private Link is available for a number of PaaS services in Azure. You can see the list here. So things like storage, SQL, other databases, Key Vault. You can use Private Link to inject those into the network. As you can see in the status here, a lot of these are still in preview. Private Link, the service for customer-owned or service provider endpoints, went GA recently. I would anticipate that we will see the other resources going GA in the not-so-distant future. Okay, so let's see how it works. I've got an Azure SQL database server here, and you can see that at the minute it's configured with no rules in the firewall section, so it's not allowed access from the Azure services, from any particular IPs or any particular virtual networks. So at the moment, nothing can access that SQL server. We're not going to change any of those. We're going to leave this server cut off from the internet and nobody will be able to access it using this method. And then we're going to use Private Link to grant access to our specific virtual network. Private Link is a top level resource, so we'll go and have a look for that. You can see that here. And that'll take us to a landing page where we can pick how we want to configure things. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to build a connection to a service. This is talking to our PaaS services. Do we want to create resources and grant somebody else access to this as a service provider? Or do we want to expose a service that we've created that others can use to connect? So this is the service provider option I talked about earlier, where you can build a whole application. As long as it sits behind a standard load balancer, you can expose that load balancer into the customer's virtual network. We're not going to delve into that today, but that's a really interesting concept if you're a service provider. So we want to grant access to a service, so we'll click on Start, pick our resource group, and we'll give it a name. This is the name for the private link itself. And we want that to be in West Europe. And next. So here is where we're configuring what resource we actually want to connect to. You can see we've got the option of connecting to a resource in my directory or connecting to a resource by resource ID or alias, which will allow me to connect to a resource and it's under a different Azure AD tenant. I'm going to pick the resource type so you can see all the supported resources here. We want a SQL server. And we're going to pick this demo server I've created. Target sub-resource, the only option here for SQL Server is SQL Server. Now we've configured the resource, we're now going to have to tell it which virtual network we want to actually connect it to. Okay, to my domain services VNet where I've got a demo machine set up. And to the client subnet, so we're attaching it to a specific subnet. If you wanted to connect it to more than one subnet, you would need to create multiple different private links. Now this DNS section is where it gets a little bit tricky. So one of the great things about private link is you don't actually have to change how you access the resource. So you can still use its URL that you would have used if it was publicly exposed to the internet to connect to that resource. This is done through DNS configuration. So when you enable private link for a resource in the DNS zones that Microsoft manage, it'll create a CNAME record that redirects traffic to this private link.database.windows.net zone. You then need to host a private copy of that zone to allow traffic to get directed to the right place. Now the simplest way to handle this is to use Azure Private DNS. So if we leave this on yes, Microsoft will create a private DNS zone for us for the private link.database.windows.net zone, and it will add the appropriate records for our server to that. If you don't want to do that, you can select the no option, that will remove that. You will then be responsible for creating the DNS records yourself, either through the host's records, or if you're running your own DNS servers, you will need to create that private link zone on your name servers and add the records yourself. To keep things simple, we're going to use the private DNS zone. Don't need tags. And we're going to create the resource. Okay, so that deployment's now complete. If we go have a look in our resource group, we can now see we've got a couple of additional resources. We've got the actual private link, and then we've got this network interface. So the network interface is what's actually been attached to our virtual network. So if we have a look at that, you can see it's actually got a private IP address on our virtual network. Over in the resource group that contains our virtual network, we can see now we've actually got a private DNS zone that it added as well. And if we have a look at that, you can see it's only got one record on at the moment, which is this plink demo server, which has been added. So now we have this referenced at plink demo server.privatelink.database.windows.net. And Microsoft has taken care of redirecting the actual proper name of the SQL database server to that URL. If we add more private link database servers in the future, we can have these joined to this DNS zone. And this DNS zone can be attached to multiple different networks if we need to use it that way. Back at our SQL server, you can see here we still haven't got any firewall rules added, so nothing externally can access that. But with our private link, we should now be able to access the database. So over on a virtual machine, I've got attached to the VNet that we've set up the private link in. We've got Management Studio running here. We're going to go ahead, we're going to connect to the SQL server using its normal private link.database.windows.net name. So this hasn't changed. We're not directly using that one from the private DNS zone we created earlier. We are using the public name. I'm going to go ahead and use SQL authentication here just for ease of use. And there we are, we're connected. And then we can do whatever normal SQL operations we can use. So this server, currently not exposed to the internet at all, we're connected over its private link. And just to prove that it is using the private IP address, if we bring up the command prompt and just do ping on that name, you can see there it's resolving to that private IP address as we'd expect. So there you have it. There's a very simple overview of how you can use private link to secure access to your Azure PaaS resources. As I mentioned, there are other features of Private Link, such as injecting your own services into clients' virtual networks that might be of use as well. And if you want to look at those, I recommend digging into the documentation. But hopefully that's been useful, and I'll see you next time on Azure Snippets.